No worries.
Good evening and welcome to another one of our wonderful book events. My name is Ben from Our Bookshop, and it's a return journey actually back to another chat with John, who we spoke to back in the autumn. A wonderful chat all about Lancaster, which I have to say it was heaven. I was in heaven, and so we're back, and we're going to be talking about his new book. And he says, I've got it lying here open actually on the page.
Well done.
He says upside, John Nichol, Tornado. And I think you've cornered the market in beautiful artwork for history books, as far as I can see, John.
That's kind of you, Ben. That image, that image is actually a composite image from a real photograph. It took some doing, but the art team at the publisher were fantastic. And what's interesting about that image is, so this was it's created from a real photograph, but all of the weapons and stuff had to be added onto it, and obviously everything in the background to make it look as though it's in the middle of an attack. And I sent the image to my squadron boss, my old squadron boss, and he said, John, who was taking pictures when we were flying over the airfield? He thought that it was a real picture, because he said that's what it was like. It was like that. So, but the team doing the artwork are fantastic, definitely.
Honestly, it's a marvel, the skills they have at the sort of artwork. So I've got copious notes. I finished the book this afternoon, and what I possibly hadn't expected is how emotional it was going to be. It was you could tell. I mean, obviously Lancaster was emotional, but the stories were 70 years old, and in the passage of time, you perhaps lose some of the edge in them. Whereas you could sense the rawness in its writing, and it's massive credit to you, John, the fact that you've managed to sort of pull the essence out and the feelings and certainly the last 50, 100 pages, there wasn't a page where I wasn't shedding tears as I'm reading it.
Well, I tell you what, mate, first of all, thank you. That's kind. This was a more difficult book to write because it's more immediate. It's my friends and some of my really close friends. Really close friends. And it was important for me not to get it wrong. And if any of them had said, John, I'm really disappointed the way that you wrote that, I would have been devastated. But they've all said, A, they've said, I'm so pleased with the way it's written. And B, they've all said, I learned a lot that I didn't know about what we all did, because it's the all-encompassing story of everybody. But the emotions were real and they were raw. And so I would say, so you said you shed a few tears in the final pages. Well, I had to interview 40 people. And at some point during every single interview, all of us were crying. And I mean, sometimes really crying, as we recalled friends who had died, or, as you know from the final pages of the book, they had lost their fathers or their sons, and that was quite emotional. But they all had to do it once. I had to do it 40 times going through it. And
blubbing like a good one, weren't you?
Well, I mean, I won't spoil it but the last few pages of the book, where I'm talking to the son of somebody who was killed 30 years after his dad died. And he's living in France. And it's kind of quite funny. And so he was going out on the Sunday morning to go and get the croissants for breakfast for his family. And I'm doing the interview. So he's got his headphones in, and I'm sitting here in London interviewing him. And by the time he gets into the boulangerie, is that right? The croissant shop. He's in tears, and he's bawling his eyes out, talking about the loss of his father, how it affected the family, how it affected him. And I can hear this conversation going on in French. Monsieur, are you okay? And it was really quite curious that 30 years on, he's having a conversation in French, assuring the baker that he's fine, but he's in real tears, talking about the loss of his father 30 years before. So that, the whole book was an emotional roller coaster.
And this was a question before that's just sprung to mind. Your interview process when you're going to see these people, are you a sort of recording person, or is it a notepad and pen?
Oh no. I'm a rubbish notepad and pen person, because all of those, for me, it's not an interview the way that a journalist might do an interview. So tell me what happened next. I have a conversation. So it's live, me and an old mate sitting down over a beer. And some of those conversations go on for hours and hours and hours, and I record it, the whole thing. And then I used to have it transcribed, but if you're having 6 hours of audio transcribed, it becomes quite expensive. And I now transcribe it myself. Yeah. And you end up with a long personal conversation, including kind of, and I leave the bits in. And so I've said it in the book on a couple of occasions. I say, so, talking about the wife of somebody who was missing in action. And I say, recalling the events 30 years on, the Tange and the author weep and because because for me, it's trying to be in the moment.
I love those touches. That
thank you.
I mean, that was I'm blubbing whilst I'm reading, and then I'm seeing you two blubbing as well. It's like I'm starting off now as well. Let's bring it to what we're supposed to be talking about, which is essentially Tornado. I know the book is about Tornado 79 to 2019. That was but it's so much more than that. And I think that so talk us through where militarily we were and why Tornado became what it was at the time when we needed it.
Well, I mean, interestingly, although the story goes from the development of the Tornado through to the end, and what it actually, the book started out, Ben, in actual fact, it was going to tell the story in full of all of it. And then when I started speaking to my friends that I didn't know their stories about the Gulf, I said, I can't make this 20% the book. The book has to be 90%, 95% of those few days of war. And so it became, in actual fact, the story of the Gulf War, of the Tornado and the families back home. But obviously it starts with the concept of the Tornado during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, communism, was facing off against the free West in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. And it starts off then, and the Tornado was conceived and developed as a Cold War nuclear strike aircraft. So when I started flying in 1986 on the Tornado, the concept would be that there'd be a buildup of hostilities in what was then the East-West German region. The Soviets would advance. We would be part of the initial assault that would destroy their airfields and hold back the initial part of the advance of their 5 million men in arms across the Warsaw Pact. And then if we couldn't do that, if the Americans hadn't got their 5 million troops onto European soil, we would start using tactical nuclear weapons to hold them back. And that's what we trained to do day after day, week after week, year after year. Never expected to do it for real. Because if we did it for real, the world would not exist in the way that we did.
I know. I'm going to show my utter ignorance, though. At the start, when I start reading Tornado, I look at it and look at its shape, and I assumed it was, dare I say, I'm going to sound like a complete idiot. I assumed it was a fighter plane. And my idea of a bomber is Lancaster.
I mean, it was a tactical bomber. I mean, there was a fighter variant of the Tornado, but it was a 1960s bit conceived, developed in the 1970s, and it was an old-fashioned bit of kit. But by today's, even by modern standards back then, it was a bit old-fashioned. But it was superb at what it was meant to do. And what people forget is that, first of all, we never expected to go to war in that way. It was a massive force. The Air Force had nearly 2,000 frontline aircraft. We had 430 Tornadoes, never mind Jaguars, Phantoms, Harriers, all of the other combat aircraft. 430 Tornadoes. It was a massive force. Never expected to be used, right to the point where we found ourselves in the desert in 1990 and
We had
1991.
430 in 1991.
Yeah, no, 430 tornadoes. Yeah.
Wow, that's far more than I was anticipating. I did write something down because the Allies used 2,430 aircraft in
Yeah.
in the Iraq War with 800,000 soldiers. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, when you say 2,400 aircraft, I mean, in actual fact, the power that could be projected into the region was even greater than that. So, so the 2,500, that was the number of sorties being flown on a daily basis, between 2,000 and 3,000 a day, a day. But we were projecting power from America. So the first attacks, you had whatever it was, I think 24 Apache helicopters flying up to the border in about 15 minutes before it all started to attack the radar sites. Everybody thought it was the stealth bombers who attacked Baghdad. It was the Apache helicopters who flew across the border in the darkness and attacked their frontline radar sites, so basically kicking in their back door. And then the stealth bombers destroyed the command and control centers. But those B-52s that flew from America, 35-hour round trips. Can you imagine 35 hours? This isn't 35 hours in a 747 in first class. This is 35 hours into a lit ejection seat like that, peeing into a plastic bag. So it was an astonishing military campaign, the likes of which has never been seen again.
Yeah, no, those B-52 routes, because those are the longest ever flights in history or something, weren't they?
They were then. I mean, there were longer ones in actual fact, flown, I think, in Libya and then possibly in the Second Gulf War. But I think it was the 35-hour were the longest ones at the time. 35 hours.
It's a big.
Can you imagine flying 35 hours in economy? Never mind 35 hours in B-52.
Yeah, I mean the issue of how you go to the toilet over that time. I mean, I assume the B-52 had a toilet.
I can't remember the exact toilet arrangements.
Well, the Lancaster had a toilet, so surely
it did, where you could move around a bit more. I don't know what the B-52. The Tornado was flying. I think in Libya. I think it flew the longest combat mission since the Second World War. And I think I'd have to go back. I think they were kind of 10 hours or something like that. Right. And on a Tornado, you're in an ejection seat. And so you should have told me. I would have got. You basically have a plastic bag with it's like a large balloon that you have to. You have to put your pin in your ejection seat because you don't want to be banging out. You have to unstrap. You know what? So you're still sitting in a combat aircraft. You have to unstrap. Then you have to unwrap everything, depending on what kit you're wearing. Get everything out. Feed everything into this floppy plastic bag, and that's difficult in itself. The floppy plastic bag has got a sponge in it, so you wee into that, and so the people are leaving the conversation, and so you have to pee into that, and then you have to do something with this bag full of wee. And some people, you had 2 or 3 of these if you're on a long range mission, and you just had to kind of just leave them on the side. People can ask the question, what happened when females started flying? Because that was never thought of. So that was very different. Yeah. And if you'd had a curry the night before, you were in serious trouble. Let me just tell you that. We are getting off the topic, really.
Well, it's impressive how we have moved. I mean, it was on my to-do list, but in terms of questions, but we got onto it a lot earlier than I was planning, frankly. But so, I mean, at the time, I mean, obviously, James Cave actually asked the question along this, and we're leading to his question. But so the UK were brought into the Gulf War, that first Gulf War, with a very specific specialization.
Yeah.
That's the right word, and that's that kind of low flying bombing kind of activity, trying to do a specific thing, destroying airfields and what have you. Let me ask you James's question. I've heard it mentioned before that during Desert Storm, a lot of the most hazardous and challenging air operations were designated to the RAF, and in particular the Tornado crews. especially during the early stages of the campaign. Was this the case? If so, what were the operational reasons for these decisions?
Well, so the Tornado was designed. If you hold your book cover up again, Ben. In fact, I'll do mine. I'll do mine.
No,
So the Tornado was designed for attacking Soviet runways, and these two, they don't look that big there, but they are JP-233 airfield denial weapons, runway denial weapons, and they're massive. It's like flying with two massive, huge IKEA wardrobe complexes under your aircraft. And what they do is they drop, they're designed to shatter, they were designed to shatter Soviet airfields. So they would punch out a number of massive cratering, kind of huge 3-foot long cratering munitions that would go down on parachutes, blast through the runway, the charge would go through the runway, and then it would explode and it would heave up the runway surface and the operating surface. And each jet carried 2 of these massive things that would each dispense 30, I think. If somebody's got all the facts and figures, they'll be able to tell me. So they were dropping 60 of these per Tornado and hundreds then of anti-personnel mines. So you were smashing the runway, and then you were creating a minefield around the smashed runway so that people couldn't get in to repair it. And if you were putting 8 jets over the airfield, you were just completely destroying it. That was the idea. And that was what everybody was terrified of at the start, was the Iraqi Air Force getting off the ground and attacking either our troop positions, because we had by then nearly 1 million troops in the desert. And if they'd used their chemical weapons on them, or if they'd got to our massive air bases in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, it would have been devastation. So we had to stop the Iraqi Air Force getting off the ground. That was the first thing that we had to do. People have forgotten this. People have forgotten what the Gulf War was about. It was about liberating Kuwait, which meant our, in the end, 1 million troops had to go over the border, turn right, go to Kuwait, and evict Iraqi troops. And to do that, we had to protect them from the Iraqi Air Force. And so that's what the Tornado was doing. And it was dangerous. And we had that unique capability. And in the first 3 days, I think we dropped thousands and thousands and thousands of runway cratering weapons and tens of thousands, many thousands of mines around their airfields. What transpired, and the military reality nobody really understands, is after probably 24 hours, 48 hours, the Iraqi Air Force kind of stopped flying. Many of them flew to Iran, which was their enemy, but they flew hundreds of jets into Iran to get away from it. And so after 3 days, the tactics changed, and then the Tornado started a different role. But for the first 3 days, it was tough. Flying into that, the center of heavily defended Iraqi airfields was a horror. And I describe it, everybody else's experience on the first night.
You describe it extraordinarily. And I have to say, I mean, it obviously was evocative of what Lancaster bombers would have had to go through going over, German cities. And
Yeah.
and I wonder whether, I mean, there's probably there is nobody who can actually compare the experience of what they went through with what, but you're probably the closest, having obviously spoken to.
Do you know what, Ben? It's a really, really good question, because all of my mates said when we were chatting about it, they said it was like being over Berlin and all the flak. And then they said, oh my God, you can't write that, John, because the guys who actually flew over Berlin amidst all the flak, they were so much more brave than us. And so they initially, and they said, you cannot put that down, that I said, this is what we imagined it was to be like in a Lancaster bomber. I did in the end, and I asked their permission. And it was, I describe in one of the opening sections of the book, the Tornado. So there's 24 Tornadoes crossing the Iraqi border on the first night, amidst 2,500 attack sorties or combat sorties that were going in. And we were trained we were highly trained. We'd flown our jets down to 15, 20, 25 feet, 650, 700 miles an hour. we'd been flying our jets at night. We trained against all of the Iraqi radar systems, the surface-to-air missiles. We'd practiced tactics against their fighters if they got off the ground. We were really worried about that. What nobody understood was what the airfield local defences were going to be like. The flak, the AAA, the anti-aircraft artillery, what is in effect tens of thousands of guns, rifles firing into the air. And I describe it, a friend of mine who led some of those first ops said, so the Tornado's flying itself, it's fully automated. The pilot is sitting with his hands on his lap, flying at 600 miles an hour. The jet is doing it itself. It's 200 feet at night. You cannot see the nose of the aircraft. You cannot see the wing of the aircraft. You're flying at 600 miles an hour. You cannot see any other aircraft around you. Total darkness. The jet's doing it itself. And he said, out in my 10 o'clock position over there, I could see a pinprick of light in the darkness. And he said, as we got closer, the pinprick of light started to evolve. And what I could see was sparkling lights, sparkling, intermeshing, interweaving lights. And then I could see that it was actually explosive lights. And I looked at this dome of exploding light, and it was an airfield. And it was an airfield that was under attack. And they were firing thousands and thousands and thousands of guns into the air, and every bullet was exploding. And he said it was a dome, a wall, a cauldron of exploding fire. And he said to his navigator in the back seat, oh my God, look at that over there in our 10 o'clock position. That looks really bad. Thank God we're not going there. and his guy in the back seat said, wait a minute, mate. And then all the jets, all flying on autopilot, all turned left and pointed at the exploding wall of fire. And nobody had ever seen this before. We trained against missiles. We trained against fighter aircraft. Nobody had ever seen a dome, a kaleidoscope of exploding fire. You can't do anything about it. He said, it's like running through a massive shower, trying not to get wet. And you just have to run in and out as fast as you can.
I know, I just cannot even start to imagine. So the main weaponry being fired just randomly upwards by the...
Exactly. It was quite literally
Iraqis.
random, mostly random fire, random. But the sight was astonishing.
It's like they're trying to create a curtain around the
airfield. It was. That's exactly what it was. It was creating a curtain of exploding lead.
I just cannot imagine. And so tell me, a AAA, what is that? That's obviously a big sort of cannony gun thing. How big are the bullets? And how big?
Well, depending on what they were, they had Iraq had a huge military machine. It had been at war with Iran for years beforehand, and so it could be anything from kind of what have I got here? Kind of just almost kind of exploding kind of heavy caliber rifle shells, right up to big explode. Well, it says canistella, huge exploding shells.
It'd be a lot nicer if it was
but when everything is just being fired in the air. So some of it was quadruple barreled big guns. Some of it was literally 1,000 troops on the ground firing AK-47 rounds into the air. But the sight, and it affected people. It affected really badly. The first night, people didn't know what to expect. So it was shocking, but it was over when you got through it in maybe, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 seconds going at that speed, 600 miles an hour. The second night, people thought this is really bad. The third night, and in the book, it's called The Mission from Hell. People thought, we can't keep doing this because jets were going down. And people said, and my boss said, and he's got the quotes in the book, he said, after we got back from the mission from hell, I looked into the faces of the colleagues that were there who'd survived.
Yeah.
And I could see the strain. I could see in their eyes that we couldn't go on doing this in the same way. Every single one of us knew that if it went on like this, we all had a matter of weeks to live. Now, that's the reality of battle. You know, you could say that to a Lancaster pilot, you could say that to a Spitfire pilot, you could say that to somebody on the ground walking the dusty alleyways of Afghanistan 10 years ago. But, you know, so people had to keep doing it, but it was really affecting people. And I detail in the book a couple of instances where people had quite severe mental breakdowns.
Yeah, we'll come on to the PTSD thing later. You did touch on it a bit earlier, the whole autopilot thing, which also surprised me, and I can understand that you're going across the lowlands of Russia or where it was planned to be used, but when you're going across a desert and you're flying at sort of 100 feet above the surface. Sand dunes have a tendency to change in size, and so how on earth could you go on autopilot where the machinery is thinking, oh, that's flat, and then there's suddenly a few big.
Well, because that's not how the machinery works, Ben. So the terrain following radar, which was designed for going into Eastern Europe, it looks at the ground ahead just like that, and it can see everything. So it can see a valley rising up and down. It can see an undulating terrain. It can see a row of power lines. And so if at night in cloud, you can't see anything, the jet can see in front of itself, and it will just climb over. It'll so over the power line and back down again, whoop, over the trees and back down again, whoop, over the valleys. And it can, oh God, it's like being on the worst roller coaster in the history of the world. What nobody, when this whole thing was, so it's designed for Europe. I can see that big lump of hillside. I can see that metal power line. I can see, and it did, the 20-foot high metal airfield fence. I'm going to go over it and back down. What transpired was when we started training hard just before the Gulf, some of the sand dunes that had been formed through the weather, actually the sand was so fine and the sand dunes were so almost see-through to the radar, it couldn't see them. Yeah. And so there were some 200 feet sand dunes in where we were flying in training in Saudi Arabia and in Oman. What transpired was it couldn't see the 200 feet sand dunes, but you set the height of the jet to fly at 200 feet. And a couple of people came back from training sorties and said, we felt a massive bump halfway through that sortie. We felt, the jet really vibrated. And they flew the sorties in daytime on the terrain following radar, and it didn't see the 200 feet sand dunes, and they'd gone across the top. And they hadn't hit the sand dune, but the turbulence had bounced them across the top. And they had to then rewrite the software, which was very basic software, for the terrain following radar.
Yeah, I'm struck reading this thing. This is 1991, and how impressive some of the technology is. And then I'm just thinking, what on earth have they got these days? I can't, I'm guessing this brings us on to Official Secrets Acts and stuff, which actually Stephen Rees asked a question about. To what extent were you bound by Official Secrets Act in the writing of Tornado? Did the book have to be vetted?
Very, very good question. I am still bound by the Official Secrets Act. I did get the book vetted. I've had some of the previous ones, but because the Tornado's no longer in service and the tactics that I describe are no longer valid for what the military does these days, I hope. And so, no, it wasn't vetted. But, some of the stuff I've done in the past has to be. And if I'd continued telling the story the way that I initially planned of the Tornado all the way through to 2019, then it definitely would have, because some of the things that it did still have relevance now. But everything in here is all 1991.
I could see, God, we're halfway through already. Honestly, I haven't even got onto any of the good bits. This is all been
What?
great.
So you're suggesting everything that I've said so far is all a bit rubbish?
No, there's some really juicy bits though. I mean, this has all been brilliant, but I am struck by. I mean, let's move on. Let's move on to your first mission. I mean, you ran a daytime run after a nighttime and obviously the Iraqis were getting used to, and it was the first run, but you were asked to do a daytime run, which in my mind is insane. You're running at 200 feet in daytime, and so
No, Ben, we weren't running at 200 feet because the jet's not flying itself. My pilot's flying it 30 feet. 30 feet.
Okay. That's only a bit taller than me. What?
Well, it's rooftop height. And a second story window of a house is about, I think, 20 feet or something like that. So it's rooftop height.
So, and it was your faithful journey. Do you want to quickly give a run? I'm sure you've done this once or twice.
That's fine.
Yeah. Give a little story of.
So we were flying into the target daytime. We hadn't fully understood what it was like for the guys before. They described it to us, but at night you could see the flak and the fire from 40, 50, 60 miles away. In the daytime, you can't see it. When you get closer, you can see it a bit. But we were flying in towards the target at 30 feet. We weren't flying over the target. We were doing an attack profile, which is called a loft or a toss. And what that means is you fly in at 30 feet, and then about a number of miles from the target, you pull the jet up really steeply, climb, and when the computer decides the right time, the bombs come off, but they fly another 3-4 miles towards the target, and you dive down and return. So you're not flying over the target. Our attack goes wrong for various reasons, almost all of them my own, and we're heading away from the target. And so basically our first attacks failed. And John Peters, myself, and my pilot and I are beating ourselves up a bit, not as much as we'd be beaten up later on.
I mean, John, he failed to fire your weaponry.
It's important, Ben. It wasn't. No. John Peters didn't do anything wrong. I was the navigator. I'm the guy who's controlling the weapons at that point. Because of a sequence of switches that you had to make, and I almost certainly didn't make them. The weapons simply didn't. The computer-generated profile didn't work as though it should have, and so the weapons didn't come off. But that was nothing to do with John Peters. That's all on me. Every single jot of that was on me. Okay. So the weapon. So John Peters and I are then talking. We're beating ourselves up in the midst of the flak, in the midst of the fire, about how it's gone wrong. It was like being a firefighter going to your first ever fire, and you've forgotten the hoses, or you've run out. It just didn't work as though it should have. And so we were really, really, really beating ourselves up with this. But actually, about 3 or 4 minutes later, heading away from target, we're flying again. So JP's flying at 30 feet, 600 miles an hour, and we're heading home. And we think that we're safe. And then suddenly we didn't see anything of this. It was the days before there was any sort of defense against heat-seeking missiles unless you saw them. But something hit us from this kind of direction. And it was like being hit by a supersonic express train. And it basically, so we're flying along 600 miles an hour, 30 feet. Suddenly the aircraft is flipped, it's upside, and it's flying sideways. And, so I've been looking up at bright blue sky, and suddenly I'm now looking up, but I'm looking up at brown sand. At least I presume it was the sand that was brown at that particular moment. With supreme skill, JP gets hold of the aircraft, manages we're about a nanosecond from hitting the ground, gets it, and we managed to start limping again. But the aircraft's been kind of taken apart a bit. So all of the technology's gone, all of the fly-by-wire stuff's gone, all the defensive system's gone, the engine is on fire. So we kind of we tried then, instead of going that way. So basically heading west to exit what we called control gates. So there were basically secret points where you could cross the border, and all of the fighters that were waiting for, like hovering, waiting for the Iraqi Air Force, they would know that if somebody crossed over this tiny gap, it was friendly. We couldn't do that. We immediately turned and we were heading, so we were presenting ourselves as a hostile aircraft. So we're now telling everybody, we've taken a hit, we're heading out, please don't we're in serious trouble. But we thought we never got anywhere near. And so we end up ejecting and end up in the desert and captured after a little bit of time on the run. And as many of the people joining us this evening will remember, we ended up 3 days of interrogation and being paraded on TV.
I know the interrogation element was something that clearly clearly I can't imagine. I mean, obviously every person has got their breaking point in terms of and you guys have had to live through that, and there's I don't know how many of you there were, there's 5 or 6 of you who have gone through the process of being interrogated by some seemingly very nasty people, but they seemed fairly directionless. They didn't really, from what you were saying in the book, they didn't really know what they wanted out of you.
It was it was interesting, horrifying, and really quite weird in actual fact. So there were, what were they, 7 RAF guys, but also, and lots of people will remember Andy McNabb, obviously. So he was there, but there were a number of other special forces guys who you've never heard of since. And everybody went through a similar process of utter violence. And it could be anything from just beatings with baseball bats or rubber hoses. It could be, cigarettes being stubbed out of you, having hot irons burning you. Robbie Stewart, who is shot down in the opening pages of the book, and we meet and see Robbie throughout the book from the start to the finish, and we see his family and how they're reacting at home. Robbie came out at 600 miles an hour in the dock. He was shot down at 600 miles an hour in the dock, and he was knocked unconscious, and basically his legs were broken when he landed unconscious, so his legs snapped, and so he wakes up in the desert with a leg at right angles and his lifeblood seeping away. He eventually gets captured, but when they're interrogating him, so first of all, they're beating him and everything. This is a couple of hours after he's been captured, but they got hold of his broken, snapped leg, and they're twisting it and pulling it, and his leg is snapped and it's punctured through the skin. But it's almost funny, if you can be funny when your leg snapped leg. And so Robbie's describing this. He said they're twisting my leg, and the pain. He said, I'm in such intense and unimaginable pain that I'm vomiting. He falls in and out of consciousness. When he's away, he's vomiting. He said, but I didn't want to get my flying suit dirty. And so he had a hanky in his pocket. And so he has got a hanky. They're beating him and twisting his broken leg, and he's throwing up into his hanky in the pain, trying to keep his flying suit clean because he's a British officer and he doesn't want to get his flying suit dirty. And it's almost laughable in its extremeness. Is extremeness a word? It's almost laughable in the way that it all happened. And as you said, Ben, sorry, I went off on the one a bit there. They didn't know what they wanted to know. And so when everybody broke, everybody gave in, whether it was an SAS guy who gave in after 6 days, or whether you gave in after 6 hours of having your broken leg twisted, everybody felt shame and humiliation and said they wished they'd never done it. But the Iraqis didn't know what they wanted to know. So they would say things like, how tall is a tornado? What's the fuel load of a tornado? How fast can it fly? And you could read this in aviation magazines. And so it became, nobody want, and I write about this, nobody wanted to give in without a fight, but everybody knew that they would eventually give in. And that's kind of quite curious. And everybody wished that they'd held on longer, but everybody said, thank God they didn't want to know too much. So there was a huge kind of a real dichotomy of opposing views going on.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, really. It'd be interesting to know what everyone's limit was, but I'm sure no one wants to go through that. I did early in the book. You reference about testicles being severed, and I have to say, I mean, are you fully equipped?
We had, again, take yourself back 30 years, and we were told, and Saddam Hussein had told his people, tear them limb from limb. And we knew that from previous conflicts in the region, aircrew who had been shot down or captured had their, the wedding tackle sliced off and stuffed in their mouths. And so we still had what were called ghoulie chits. So basically something from the 1920s that said, and it was in English and in Arabic, if you return this airman to safety, completely intact, Her Majesty's government will pay you, I can't remember what it was, $10,000 or something like that. And we also had, every single one of us had, I think it was £1,000 in gold sovereigns to bribe local tribesmen to, well, I remember when I was captured. So I've got my little Walther PP high power, James Bond, which looks fantastic in a James Bond film. But let me tell you, when 16 Iraqi soldiers are firing AK-47s at you, your James Bond gun is rubbish. And I mean really rubbish. But we also had $1,000 or £1,000 of gold sovereigns. And so these people are coming towards you and they're kicking 7 bells out of you and threatening to kill you. You kind of hold up this $1,000 to bribe them. And well, they just take the $1,000 in gold coins. And I remember the face of the young Iraqi conscript who got to me, found those gold sovereigns. And what would that be worth to an Iraqi conscript? A lifetime of money? Certainly 20 years of salary. And he just kind of took them, put them in his pocket, and continued kicking 7 bells out.
Ignored any notes about getting any
No,
more money.
no notes, none of that. None of that.
So you were transferred from one prison to another, and I mean, that must have been fairly bleak, or remarkably bleak, in terms of the loneliness, the being, not knowing whether your partner was alive, not knowing whether. I mean, you were obviously one of the first one to be shot down. So, as far as you're concerned, nobody else had been shot down at all.
We didn't know. So we were kept in utter isolation in various prisons, some military. We ended up at one point for 3 weeks with the Mukhabarat, which is the Iraqi secret police, you'd call them. That was bad. That was really, really, really bad. But you never knew. You could hear a voice every now and then. But then on the 23rd of February, the secret police prison was bombed by Americans. And we were, oh my God, it was bad. We were really nearly killed there. It was really, really bad to be in the midst of the bombing. Yeah. But then we were kind of dragged out of the rubble and we were taken to Abu Ghraib. So a prison that became notorious.
You've jumped a bit there, because at the point when you're in that previous prison, you still feel you're alone. You still feel absolutely alone. And then suddenly it's bombed.
Yeah.
And suddenly you realize you're on a floor with all your comrades, and you start shouting at each other. Can you? I just cannot imagine that.
So you did. So, but this is the first till the 23rd of February. So was that 4 weeks? And you didn't know. You could, every now and then you heard another voice, so you knew that was perhaps another person there, but you didn't know who. And then the prison was bombed, and so the guards had run away. Some of the doors were blown off. This was the prisons that you see on horror movies. So 3-inch steel doors, 5-inch solid walls. It was terrible, terrible, terrible. And suddenly some of the doors are blown off, the hatches are blown open, and just you hear people shouting, and you can hear. I hear mates of mine, and what somebody described it, especially American, said it was like the Brits were at a garden party, leaning on a wall, nattering to their mates. Yay, Rupert, how are you? Oh, how you doing? How's the war gone? And Steve, I haven't heard of you. Bloody hell, Dave, where have you been?
Which is why I find this picture here quite poignant. That one there.
Yeah.
Isn't that all the guys who are in your?
It is. So if you look at, if you just keep that picture up there, Ben. So on the left, Dave Waddington. So Dave was a really young pilot then, a very young pilot. He went on to command the Tornado Force. He was shot down with Robbie Stewart. Robbie broke his legs. Second in the with a grey hair. No. If you go with a pink trousers, that's Rupert Clark. Rupert was shot down on the 14th. His navigator was killed in that incident, and that's what I was talking about. Rupert, I heard Rupert in that prison. Robbie Stewart's in the centre. So Robbie snapped his legs. Robbie and Dave didn't know if they were alive. They didn't know who was alive. So Robbie and Dave were chatting to us in this prison, and that's where they both discovered that they were both alive. John Peters, my pilot, the blue jacket.
Your pilot there.
Yeah. I'm there with actually, if you look at that, can you see it? I've got a can of Stella in my hand. In that picture, they've all got glasses of champagne.
I know.
I've got a can of Stella. And then on the end is Bob.
You're showing your northeastern roots.
I know. So that's when people started to discover, and we were moved out of that prison, and we were thrown onto a bus, and you weren't blindfolded, but because it was so chaotic because of the bombing and people had been killed. But you suddenly was lying on the floor of this bus, and there was a Kuwaiti pilot there, and they were battering him because they blamed him for everything. They were battering 7 bells out of him. And you could watch this going on, but you had your head down. But it sounds quite pathetic now. People put their arms out as we were lying on the floor, and somebody would touch your hand. You're almost getting quite emotional. You're holding hands with somebody, and the emotion was just astonishing that you discovered there were loads of other people in that position, and it was a real comfort until we were then thrown into Abu Ghraib, when it all became really, really terrible again.
Well, it sounds like the food in Abu Ghraib was far better than anything.
So Abu Ghraib, obviously notorious for brutality. That's where a terrible place. But in the Mukhabarak prison that was bombed, they kind of gave us maybe a piece of pita bread and a little plastic cup of water once a day. So in 7 weeks, I lost, I think, 2.5 stone. My wife's, I can hear her pottering around outside. She tells me I should be going back to do the Iraqi diet quite soon in that program. 2.5 stone in 7 weeks. But when we got to Abu Ghraib, everybody on the first night was bunged into a cell. So I think there were 7 of us in this tiny cell, half the size of my office. And it was amazing to be together and to just chat and to have these friendly faces. And in the morning, they brought in a washing up bowl full of lentil and leek soup, hot, steaming lentil and naan bread. And 7 of us starving. And everybody's standing in a little circle. And it's like a royal garden party, because nobody wants to have more than their share. So you take a little sip out the washing up bowl, have a little piece of bread, and then you pass it on after you. No, you please have more. And it was really, really, really weird that after everything that went wrong and everything that was just so awful and terrifying, people were kind of sharing a bowl of lentil and leek, a washing up bowl. And I can still,
and you can
I'd never had it
about it.
I'd never had anything like that. And ever since, every time I go out to an Indian restaurant, I always order tarka dal, stewed lentils, every single time. My wife, we order an Indian tarka dal, yeah, because 30 years on, stewed lentils mean a lot to me.
Brilliant. Well, I know where to take you when you come and do a book event. When you come and do a book event in Tring.
Yeah.
Stephen Rees asked a question. I think it's going to be a long answer to that. I've yet to read the book, but can you give me an overview of events of preparation leading up to a nighttime sortie? That's quite a long answer, I think. So it is detailed in the book in lots of deep. What I'd like to do is probably rush through a whole load of points I've got here.
Sure. I'll try and not wax on lyrical.
Because honestly, time has ticked so fast. I remember, I mean, our Lancaster event went on to 75 minutes in the end. Stuart Green asked, despite the automation available, it's clear the Tornado, he's quite rightly bringing us back to what we're supposed to be talking about. Tornado was a real aeroplane. Do you think the interface between the crew and the modern aircraft is becoming too wide?
Well, what you're asking is about the automation. So I don't know a huge amount about the technicalities of the modern fighters, but the answer, I think, speaking to a few of my friends who are still kicking around, would be no. You know, if you look at the cockpit of Tornado, it was very basic. It was designed in the 70s. Now, look at the cockpit of an F-35 or a Typhoon. It's like being in a Tesla car. You have all of the information is presented to you. You not only have all of the information in your aircraft, your data linked to everybody else and to the ground. So you're linked into this amazing machine that we never had in that way. So no, I don't think it is. And you just have to see what people are doing to know that. Sorry, Ben.
One problem is being flown by a human, and in the end, a human can only do so much and take on so much.
Well, it can, and I've no doubt that at some point a human will be superseded. But I have to say that I think it's some time off, because you can have a remotely piloted drone from Las Vegas, where we fly them, or from Lincolnshire, but nothing can compare to the human eye looking out, taking in the information and looking at it in the heat of battle. So I think we will get there, but not for a little while.
Okay, listen, let me jump through a few of my notes here, which I was struck by the fact that you were living in a five-star hotel whilst you were fighting a war. I mean, this is the most bizarre contrast between going home to this, this incredible hotel, lying on a lounger, having club sandwiches and cocktails, and then going off for a night's work and bombing the hell out of someone. I mean, what on earth?
I think, any of my army friends who would be watching would say a typical Air Force, living in a hotel. But the simple fact was that we were based on the Isle of Bahrain and there was no military accommodation. So you had to stay somewhere. And we were based in the five-star Sheraton Hotel. And whilst it was fantastic, there's no doubt that some of my other friends who were living in much more austere conditions in Saudi Arabia, in really rough accommodation, nothing like the troops at the front line, living in trenches and sleeping under their vehicles. But it was quite difficult, and it posed problems to live in and socialize in what was quite an open environment, and then go to war and lose friends, and then come back and go and have a beer and talk. So it did pose problems, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah. And the other weird aspect of that is you had the media living with you. I mean,
Yeah.
I found that extraordinary. I mean, I guess 30 years on, we can't even imagine that would ever happen. But
oh, you would never do that. So some people that became friends. So Mark Austin, who is now at Sky News, was there. A GMTV reporter was there. Now Good Morning Britain. And they became trusted friends. Not all the media was trusted, but they became trusted friends. But they were reporting on tornadoes taking off, and then drinking in the hotel with people, and also saying, in actual fact, the reality was some of the people that we had a beer with last night are dead. And it became quite difficult for them as well. And there's an account in the book of one of the reporters who really, when somebody he became really close with, and he played squash with, was shot down, caused him some real problems in actual fact.
Yeah.
You would never do that now. You would never do that. Not that in that one.
No. And there was one case where the journalist, he published far more than he should have done. And there were two ways of dealing with that. One was the official channels, and the other route was the military channel.
Well, the official channel said, if you do that again, you will be evicted from both the base and the hotel. You will have no access. The Tornado boys took matters more into their own hands, got him, made it plain that they were not happy with what he'd done, that he'd breached their trust, You can't drink with somebody at 7 o'clock at night after they've come back from a sortie and then report that. You can't do that. And he ended up fully clothed in the Sheraton Hotel pool, and he didn't do it again.
Good.
I won't tell you who it was. He became quite famous.
Did he? Okay. That's, you know, we're going to overrun, I'm afraid. There's no.
Hold on, before you do that. Cheers. Cheers. Can you bring me another lager, please? Sorry.
Another lager. I don't have someone to get me one.
And the dog's looking at me. What? I can't get you a flippin'.
Maybe you could pass me one whilst we're. So the bit you touch on, which is so emotional, is the plight of.
Hold on, she's with a wait. Can you just pop me another can of Stella, right?
The plight of the
I'm in
family.
the middle of a live Stella.
Yeah, no, John, it was the plight of the families at home, and and you know, and how you touch on them and weave them in and out of the story is extraordinary. And actually, there's probably more tears shed for them and how they've had to deal with it, and it kind of, they were dealing with a historic kind of old-fashioned sort of financial element when.
Thank you, my love.
When you know, wives have been widowed or crew are missing in action, suddenly this whole machine kicks in where, right, you're not getting any more money. I mean, that's just extraordinary.
It was, I describe it as a battle being fought on two fronts. So you had the battle being fought by the crews, but their families back home had a really tough time. Not just the simple basics. So the knock at the door. The knock at the door where I describe it, one of the mothers, they're living in Bolton in their little terraced house, 1 o'clock in the morning, woken up by a battering at the door. They put their dressing gowns on, go downstairs. And she said, we opened the door and there were two men in smart RAF uniforms and a priest. And she said, I knew it was bad. I knew it was very bad. And so they're living that. But then you have the RAF system, the Ministry of Defence system. And so some of the wives whose husbands were missing in action then had a second knock at the door to say, we don't know anything else about your husband who's missing, but we have to tell you that military regulations say you can't have his money, you can't have his pay anymore. Because that's what the regulations stated from the Second World War. And so they quite literally had their pay stopped. And so they're then scrabbling around trying to pay the bills because somebody in the Ministry of Defence has looked at an old dusty manual that said, stop the pay. And even worse, and I found it was all terrible. And it was not a personal thing, it was the system that went into operation. Some of the wives are being told, you can't have your husband's money because women can't look after their husband's money. So your husband's money, the half the pay,
that's
that
not what they said, that's just what they were inferring. No,
but they said, so we've stopped his flying pay because he's not flying, and he's missing in action, he's not flying. So you can't have that aspect, which was a substantial amount. But not only that, because your husband is missing in action and he's the one who gets paid, you can't have that anymore in your joint account. That will be paid into the RAF administration account, and you can take yourself to the administration section, present yourself to a junior non-commissioned officer and ask for some money. And it was sinful what they did, but it wasn't out of spite. It was just the system. It all changed, but it was just
thing to change it. But off the back of this, the War Widows Association was formed.
It was, and again, so one of the people in the book who runs from the start to finish, Jenny Green, her husband was killed in the early days. She got the knock at the door. She said it was like, so within days, she had to start to move out of her military accommodation because somebody was coming in to replace her husband. She had to move out. She said, we felt as though we were not wanted. We were a symbol of something that had happened. And again, it was just the system. And she set up then the War Widows Association. And again, something terrible. So she then got his war pension, his military pension, but you are not allowed then to move on with your life. You couldn't form a relationship with somebody new. You couldn't have a new partner, because that meant that you didn't need the military pension. So they said, if you form a new relationship and if you get married, your military pension will be taken away. You can sleep with as many people as you want on a casual basis, but if you form a new relationship, your money will be taken. That's terrible, because the notion was the lady has got somebody else to look after her now, and they changed that. And some of the things that came out of that conflict were archaic in actual fact.
Honestly, extraordinary. And I am conscious we are overrunning. I do, however, want to talk about briefly, or as briefly as we can, PTSD. You mentioned it earlier. I think the work that Gordon Turnbull did sounds extraordinary. What he managed to do with that first crewman that went home. Do you want to quickly reference that story?
And so it was bad. What people were seeing was bad, and a number of people were taken off operations, and probably 2 had some quite severe mental breakdowns. And a number were flown home into psychiatric care. But what was amazing was the RAF was quite advanced in its care and understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so one of the guys who ended up in the psychiatric hospital really, really in a bad way was actually rehabilitated quite quickly, simply by information and knowledge and explanation of what he was going through. And he ended up back 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, back on the front line. And we were looked after really well by the psychiatrists. And almost everybody had some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I still do. Fireworks going off, bangs, I'm terrible. But that's 30 years on. And it was about understanding how you're affected by it. I think the one thing I would say is that there were 45,000 British servicemen and women in the Gulf, and only a handful got that expert care. It's different now, but it was, it was fantastic for us.
But you as one of the 6 or 7 prisoners of war, you were then taken to Cyprus against your will, it seems.
Yeah.
You were Mr. Argumentative on the whole subject of it, but I think you were brought around in the end.
Yeah, listen. The military is terrible. Military and the military men in particular are terrible at talking about their emotions. And all we wanted to do, all we thought was the best thing for us, was to go home to our families and our friends, have a few beers and a curry. And Gordon Turnbull, the psychiatrist, knew that this would be a disaster. And he had to persuade senior RAF personnel that it would be a disaster. And we were taken to Cyprus, and he had to persuade us. And I was one of the ones who kind of stood toe to toe with him. And he tells this story. And he was a senior officer. He was a wing commander, a senior RAF officer. And he tells the story, and I can't remember it. He said, John Nichol stood toe to toe with us. And he said, and I said, sir, this is shite. None of us want this nonsense. We want to go home. And he said, John, please just stick with me. Please give it a go. And he was right. And it was 2.5, 3 days. Over those 3 days, he educated us. He showed us how we would feel. He showed us what to expect. And he really made a difference. I didn't know that at the time.
Gosh, we've barely touched on things I wanted to talk about, and I have to apologise to the audience. I'll tell you what, there is one rather nice question from David Parker. I will throw this in. Would like to ask John how and why he chose to be a navigator instead of a pilot, and additionally, does he have a pilot's license himself? Are you still flying?
A couple of great questions there. There are very, very, very few people in the Air Force who joined when I did who chose to be a navigator. So I applied to be, I was already in the Air Force. I was a technician, corporal, and I wanted to be commissioned and applied to be a pilot. And you have to do all the tests. And my test scores didn't come out to be a fast jet pilot. And so they said, you can go this other route and perhaps start to train as a multi-engine pilot or be a navigator. And almost everybody applied from the first go to be a pilot. And many navigators were people who'd started the pilot training course and didn't get through it, and then were transferred into being a navigator. So I wanted to be a pilot, but wasn't good enough. Do I have a pilot's license? No, I never liked flying. I'm not one of those people I've been lucky enough to go and fly some amazing aircraft from the back, MiG-29s, Lightnings, F-18s, but I've never kind of, some of my mates were real, they built their own bloody aircraft out of balsa wood in their garages. I never wanted to do that. It always made me feel a bit airsick, to be perfectly honest.
Oh my, I don't know. That's an interesting way of finishing our event. Audience, thank you so much for joining us. I have put a link to our YouTube channel. I'll be posting this interview on there at some point in the next few days. It's Independent Bookshop Week, so we've kind of got a busy run of events. It's also Armed Forces Week, and I have to thank Caroline Wallace, who I know is watching, who's part of Decorum Council. She was basically the nudge to put on a few events this week, really relating to armed forces, which led to doing John's event. This book was only published this month, but we also interviewed Michael Morpurgo yesterday as part of that, and that will be on our YouTube channel. You know Michael, don't you?
I know. So Michael's such a nice guy, such a love, and his books clearly, compared to him, I'm mere dust in the dirt. His books are my God, if I could emulate him, they were astonishing.
I did tell him I was interviewing you today, and because it was such an honor interviewing him, and he said, well, I didn't have to get myself shot down over enemy territory to write all my stories.
He's being very generous in his skill. Ben, I would say to you, thank you. And thank you to the independent bookshops, such an important part of the community, the high street, and to us authors. A massive, yes, there are some big online sellers, and yes, there are, well, one or two big chains now, but the independent booksellers, the stuff that you do is so important and crucial to we authors. So thank you for everything that you do.
It's always a pleasure, and honestly, events like this, hardback book selling through interviews, it makes a big difference to us. An event like tonight would probably be a couple of days sales for us, which really helps in the turnover of the shop. Yeah. So thank you, frankly. So an audience, thank you again, John. Massive thanks to you, and we will see you. What's the next plane you're writing about?
Can't tell you.
I'm guessing you've got your Hawker, your Hurricane. You've got your Vulcan, maybe, or maybe an American.
Listen, if you've got I'll tell you. People have said, what's your next book? So why don't you do the Hurricane? Why don't you do the Mosquito? Well, the reality is that, as you know from my books, Ben, because we've spoken about them, I require living people to interview, to speak to sit with. And they just aren't the veterans from the World War II anymore. So there's going to be no more World War II books from me for the foreseeable future. People have said,
There's Stuart Green has said, write about the Sterling. His dad.
But there's no veterans.
Nav on the Sterling.
There's no but there's no veterans. There are some accounts, but I want to sit with veterans. So can't do any more World War II books for the foreseeable future. I might go back and look at previous accounts. Can't do the Vulcan. Roland White's done that really well with Vulcan 6 or 7. Can't do the Harrier. That's been done. The Jaguar, the Phantom, the Buccaneer, not really the depth of stories that you've got for Tornado. Yeah. So I'm going in a new direction. It's still aviation, but you might be surprised, Ben. And I'll be knocking on your door in, I don't know, it'll be a year, 18 months with a new idea. The cover, I think you'll love the cover.
Oh, I love all your covers. I've actually still got some of your posters from Lancaster left. So if any of the audience want to come and pick one up, you're very welcome. But right, let's say goodbye, and we'll see you very soon. And
thank you. Thanks audience. Thanks for joining us. It's been a lovely evening. Thanks, Ben.